Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens when we're alone? Not that loneliness of a few hours, but that isolation that extends for days, weeks, maybe months. Most of us run from this possibility as if it were a sentence. But what if I told you that this fear might be hiding something valuable? Something our noisy routine never let us discover? There's a French writer named Sidonie Gabrielle Colette who said something fascinating. Solitude can be wine, tonic, or poison, depending on the moment. Think about that. The same experience can nourish, heal, or destroy. It all depends on how you face it and what you carry inside when the doors close. We're social creatures by nature. That's undeniable. But life puts us in situations where isolation happens, whether we want it or not. An illness that keeps us home. The lack of people around. A remote place where we live. Crises that shut down the entire world at once. And when that happens, something interesting emerges. The chance to look inward. The chance to discover who you are when no one's watching. Isolation isn't a uniform experience. It can happen alone or surrounded by other people, but still isolated from the rest of the world. Psychologist Paul Kopp has pointed out that the psychological effects of this can be profound, both for better and for worse. The difference lies in how you respond. If you maintain contact when possible, even if it's through a window or a screen, and if you choose to face this time with curiosity instead of despair, something changes. The prison transforms into a monastery. The exile becomes a retreat. But let's go beyond the obvious. Let's explore what really happens when you stop running and sit with yourself. Because there's an entire world hidden in the silence, and most people will never know it. When you find yourself removed from the daily rush, from automatic conversations, from commitments that fill every hour of the day, something begins to emerge. It's like when you turn off the television in a noisy house and suddenly notice the sound of rain outside. That sound was always there. You just never had space to hear it. Deep reflection doesn't happen amid chaos. It needs space, it needs silence, it needs time without interruptions. And isolation, however uncomfortable it may be at first, offers exactly that. You're no longer being pulled in 1,000 different directions. You don't need to respond to others' expectations every minute. For the first time in a long while, you can simply exist and observe that existence. It's in this space that real questions arise. Not those superficial questions we ask on autopilot, but the questions that really matter. What am I doing with my life? Why do I make the choices I make? These connections I maintain, do they nourish me or drain me? Who would I be if no one were watching? These questions scare a lot of people. That's why most prefer to keep the noise on all the time. But if you have the courage to stay with them, to really sit and let them develop without rushing, something profound happens. You begin to see patterns. You start to understand why you always end up in the same places, with the same people, facing the same problems. Public busyness has a way of keeping us on the surface, always reacting, always responding, always performing. You become an edited version of yourself, calibrated to please, to fit in, to not cause problems. But in isolation, this layer begins to fall. There's no audience, there's no jury. It's just you and your thoughts. Nietzsche talked about discovering the authentic self away from group influence. He knew that our decisions are rarely truly ours when we're constantly immersed in social dynamics. Groups have their own logic, their own invisible pressures, and you adapt to them without even realizing it. Sherry Bourg-Carter, who studies human behavior, points out exactly this. Most of our decisions happen unconsciously, shaped by the groups we belong to. You think you chose that outfit, that job, that opinion. But did you really? Or did you just absorb what was around you and call it your own choice? In isolation, you can finally separate what's yours from what's borrowed. What you really want from what you've been told you should want. It's a distillation process. You're removing the impurities, the external influences, until something purer remains. Something more true. A simple but powerful tool for this is writing. It doesn't need to be anything elaborate. Just grab a notebook and put your thoughts on paper. Writing forces you to organize mental chaos. You start with a confusion of feelings and ideas, but when you need to transform this into sentences, into words that make sense, something clarifies. It's as if your own thoughts were hidden behind a fog, and writing is the wind that disperses it. You read what you wrote and think, so that's what I was feeling. That's why I did that. Understanding comes after, not before. And isolation offers all the time necessary for this process to happen without rushing. But reflection isn't the only thing that emerges in isolation. There's something more concrete, more physical happening too. Something related to the space where you live. Carl Jung had an interesting view on environments. For him, the place where we live isn't just a neutral backdrop. It's an extension of our internal world. If your home is chaotic, your mind probably is too. If you ignore your home, you're ignoring part of yourself. Think about how many times you pass through your house like a ghost. You rush out in the morning, come back exhausted at night, sleep, and repeat. You live there, but you don't really live there. The space becomes just a place of passage, not a refuge, not a real home. Busy life creates this disconnection. You don't have time to organize that drawer. You don't have energy to think about how to make your room more welcoming. That forgotten corner stays forgotten for months, accumulating things you don't even remember why you bought. And all of this accumulates, not just physically, but psychologically. Isolation changes this. Suddenly, you're home all day. Every room, every object, every detail becomes visible in a way it wasn't before. And you realize, this place could be so much better. This space could really support me, instead of just sheltering me. So you start reorganizing. You throw away what no longer serves. You move furniture. You clean forgotten corners. And something curious happens. Every change in physical space seems to echo internally. You're not just tidying the house, you're tidying yourself. Creating a real comfort zone, not in the sense of complacency, but of a place that truly nurtures you, has profound effects. Creativity flows better in environments you love. Productivity increases when you're not fighting against your own space. And personal development happens more easily when you're not constantly irritated by the mess around you. There's something almost meditative about transforming your home. You're in the present, focused on simple but meaningful actions. And when you finish, when you look around and see a space that truly reflects who you are, a sense of peace settles in, as if you had created roots for the first time in years. These roots matter. They stabilize you. And from this stability, you can start looking forward in a new way. Most people live reactively. Something happens, you react. A problem arises, you put out the fire. An opportunity comes, you decide on impulse. Life becomes a sequence of automatic responses, without much reflection on where all this is taking you. It's like driving with your eyes fixed on the bumper ahead. You can avoid crashing, you can follow the flow of traffic, but you have no idea where the road is going. And then, one day, you stop, look around, and realize you're in a place you never wanted to be. But how did you get there? You just followed the flow. Isolation breaks this cycle. For the first time in a long while, you have space to lift your head and look at the horizon. Where do I want to go? What really matters to me? If I could design my life from scratch, what would it look like? These aren't easy questions, and they certainly don't have quick answers. But you finally have time to sit with them, to let them mature, to explore possibilities without the pressure to decide immediately. There's an old phrase from Lao Tzu that captures this perfectly. He says to be still until the mud settles and the water becomes clear. It's a powerful image. When you're always in motion, always stirring the waters, the mud stays suspended. You can't see through it. Everything seems confusing, urgent, impossible to navigate. But when you stop, when you stay really still for long enough, the mud settles. The particles that were floating and blocking your vision sink to the bottom. And suddenly, you can see. The water is clear. The path is visible. This clarity is pure gold for life planning. You're no longer making choices based on panic or external pressure. You're making choices based on a deeper understanding of who you are and what you want. And these choices, when they come from this place of inner stillness, tend to be much more aligned with your true path. You can finally define real goals. Not those goals you think you should have because everyone has them, but goals that make your eyes light up when you think about them. Goals that, even being difficult, seem worth every drop of effort. And when you have clarity about where you want to go, isolation stops feeling like a prison. It becomes a training ground, a place to prepare, to build solid foundations, to develop the skills you'll need when the doors open again. But this doesn't mean you need to be completely disconnected from the world. In fact, Modern isolation has a huge advantage over isolation from any other era in history. Technology. Think about it. 100 years ago, if you were isolated, you were truly alone. No communication, no connection, no way to see or hear other people. Today, you can be physically isolated, but socially connected in ways our ancestors could never imagine. Video calls allow you to see the faces of people you love, even if they're on the other side of the world. Online games create shared spaces where you can interact, cooperate, compete. Virtual group activities, from yoga classes to book clubs, keep the sense of community alive even when bodies are separated. The key isn't to lament what you've lost. It's to actively explore alternatives. It's to be creative about maintaining human connections in new ways. Because here's the truth. Even before isolation, how many of your social interactions were really deep? How many times were you physically present but mentally absent? Isolation forces you to be more intentional about connections. You can no longer count on casual or accidental encounters. If you want to talk to someone, you need to make it happen. And there's something beautiful about that. There's something more genuine about a conversation that both people actively chose to have. Even more interesting is that isolation can reveal forgotten connections. That neighbor you always greet but never really talk to. That school friend you lost touch with years ago. That elderly relative who always gets put off for later. Suddenly, you have time. And you have a reason to reach out to these people, to reconnect, to build bridges that the rush of normal life had let burn. How many deep friendships started exactly like this? With someone having enough time to really invest in a connection. And there's something else happening in this process. Something that goes beyond just socializing in different ways. It has to do with discovering parts of yourself that were dormant. Think about your life before isolation. How many hours of the day were really yours? Between work, commutes, social obligations, household tasks done in a rush, how much time was left for you to simply be? To explore interests, to develop hobbies, to do things for the pure pleasure of doing them? For most people, the answer is almost nothing. Life becomes so full of obligations that there's no room left for curiosity, for experimentation, for fun without a defined purpose. Isolation radically changes this equation. Suddenly you have hours that didn't exist before. And at first, this can even be scary. You don't know what to do with so much free time. Anxiety can arise. The feeling that you should be doing something productive, something useful, something that justifies your existence. But if you get through this initial layer of discomfort, something fascinating begins to emerge. Old interests resurface. That desire to draw you had at 15. That musical instrument you always wanted to learn. That creative project that always stayed on the someday list. These interests didn't die. They were just buried under layers of responsibility and rush. And now, with time and space, they're coming back to breathe. Carl Jung had a concept for this. He called these undeveloped parts of ourselves the shadow. Not in the sense of something bad, but of something that's in the darkness. Aspects of your being that exist, but that you haven't given attention to, haven't developed, haven't integrated into your conscious life. Modern life forces us to be one-dimensional. You are your job. You are your role in the family. You are your responsibilities. And everything else stays in the dark. Everything else becomes fantasy, becomes if I had time, becomes future regret. Isolation shines a light on this darkness. Not all at once, not abruptly, but gradually you start to see what's there, and you can finally choose to bring these parts back into your active life. Maybe you've always been someone creative, but spent the last 10 years in a purely analytical job. Maybe you've always loved nature, but live in a place where you never have time to go out. Maybe you have a voice you've never used, a story you've never told, a skill you've never practiced. Isolation is a chance to reconnect with these lost facets, to integrate them, to become a more complete person, not because you added something new, but because you recovered something that was always yours. And when you do this, when you really allow yourself to explore these repressed interests, something magical happens. Your creativity explodes. There are studies about this. Christopher Long and James Averill did research showing that solitude has a direct relationship with creativity. Not because solitude magically makes you more creative, but because it removes the barriers that were blocking your natural creativity. When you're constantly surrounded by people, constantly consuming others' opinions and perspectives, it's hard to hear your own voice. Your ideas mix with others' ideas until you no longer know what's original and what's borrowed. But in solitude, in real quietness, your creative voice can finally speak, and it has a lot to say. It was just waiting for a chance to be heard. Think about the great creatives in history. Many of them had periods of intense solitude where their best works were created. Not because they were anti-social or because they hated people, but because they understood that deep creation needs deep immersion, and deep immersion needs absence of distractions. Nikola Tesla is a fascinating example of this. Many of his most important discoveries happened in periods where he was completely absorbed in work, isolated from normal social interactions. He wasn't running from humanity. He was diving into possibilities that could only be explored in focused solitude. And you don't need to be a scientific genius for this. The same dynamic applies to any creative work. Writing, painting, composing music, developing software, creating a business, solving complex problems. All benefit from uninterrupted periods of deep focus. Isolation offers exactly that. No one will interrupt you every 15 minutes. No meeting will break your flow of thought. No social obligation will pull you out of the state of creative immersion. You can work on a project for hours. You can get completely lost in it. And it's in these states of complete loss, where time disappears and there's only you and the work, that the best things emerge. Many entrepreneurs discover this. They use periods of isolation to build business foundations they wouldn't have time to develop in normal life, to write the book they always wanted to write, to create the product they always dreamed of creating. Because creativity isn't just art. Creativity is solving problems in new ways. It's making connections no one else has seen. It's transforming vision into reality. And all of this requires time, space, and absence of interruptions. The inability to be alone, to really dive into productive solitude, might be what's preventing many people from developing their full creative potential. They have the talent, they have the will, but they never have the time and space necessary for these talents to truly flourish. Isolation removes this barrier. And if you know how to use this time, if you really dedicate yourself to exploring your creativity without external limits, you can emerge from isolation with something tangible. Something that didn't exist before. Something only you could have created. But while you're creating, while you're exploring new facets of yourself, something more subtle is also happening. Something related to how you see the world and your place in it. Modern society operates on a very specific system. It teaches you that happiness is always outside of you. Always in the next product, the next job, the next relationship, the next experience. If you just earn more money, if you just get that promotion, if you just buy that thing, then you'll be happy. It's an endless cycle. Because as soon as you reach one goal, another appears. As soon as you buy something, you're already looking at the next purchase. Happiness is always on the horizon. Always one step away. Always in the future. This mindset traps us in a race that never ends. We work to earn money to buy things that supposedly will make us happy. And when these things don't deliver the promised happiness, we work more to buy more, hoping this time will be different. Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls this the burnout society. We're all exhausted from chasing a happiness that always escapes. And we don't even realize we're trapped in a system that benefits from this infinite pursuit. Isolation temporarily breaks this connection. Suddenly you can't go out and buy. You can't work overtime to earn more. You can't fill the void with consumption. The stores are closed. The opportunities to spend are limited. The system that kept you running has stopped. And at first, this can generate anxiety. How will I be happy if I can't do the things that normally make me happy? But if you stay with this discomfort long enough, a realization begins to emerge. You realize you're not as unhappy as you expected. In fact, after the initial anxiety passes, you might even be more at peace than you were before. Because you're no longer in a race. You're no longer comparing yourself. You're no longer trying to prove your worth through external acquisitions and achievements. This realization is revolutionary. It reveals that happiness, peace, contentment were always inside. You just never had enough silence to notice. When your basic needs are met, when you have shelter, food, security, the rest is internal work. It's about how you relate to yourself, to your thoughts, to your existence. And this can't be bought. It can't be achieved through external accomplishments. Isolation invites you, or rather, forces you to do this internal work. To find contentment in what you already have. To appreciate simplicity. To realize you don't need as much as society made you believe. It's as if you've been fed a diet of emotional fast food for years. Quick consumption. Instant but superficial satisfaction. Always wanting more right after. And suddenly, you're forced to make your own food. To cook slowly. To savor simple ingredients. At first, you might miss that artificial intensity. But over time, your palate changes. You start to appreciate more subtle flavors. You start to realize that real satisfaction is different from instant gratification. This detachment from consumerism doesn't mean you'll never buy anything again or that you'll become an ascetic living in a cave. It means you develop a healthier relationship with material things. They return to being tools, means to ends, instead of ends in themselves. You buy because you need, not because you're trying to fill a hole. You work because you value the work and what it provides, not because you're trapped in an endless hamster wheel. You can finally breathe. And in this breathing space, in this pause from the religion of money, as some philosophers call it, you can redefine what really matters to you. You can build a life based on internal values instead of external validation. This isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process, a gradual unfolding of consciousness. But isolation creates the perfect conditions for this process to begin. Because when all external distractions are removed, when you can no longer run away from yourself, you finally have to deal with what's inside. And this, however scary it may seem at first, is where true transformation happens. You discover you're stronger than you thought, more resilient, more capable of finding joy in simple things. You don't need so much constant entertainment. You don't need constant approval. You don't need constant stimulation. You can simply exist and realize that's enough, that you are enough. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of isolation. Not the skills you develop, not the projects you complete, not the goals you achieve, but this fundamental realization that you are complete as you are, that you always were. The rush of the world makes us forget this, makes us feel inadequate, always lacking something, always needing to improve, always needing to be more. And in the silence of isolation, you can finally hear a different voice. It's the voice that was always there, but that you never had enough quietness to hear. And it says something simple, but powerful. You're okay. Exactly as you are. In this moment. This doesn't mean complacency. It doesn't mean stopping growing or seeking improvements. It means growing from a place of acceptance instead of inadequacy. It means seeking improvements because you want to, not because you're trying to escape from yourself. And when you operate from this place, when you act from fullness instead of lack, everything changes. Your relationships change because you're no longer expecting other people to complete you. Your work changes because you're no longer seeking validation through achievements. Your entire life changes because you're no longer running from yourself. You're finally home. Not just in the physical house you organized and transformed during isolation, but home within yourself. And this is a home you can take anywhere. When isolation eventually ends, when the doors open again and the world returns with all its intensity, you won't be the same person. You'll have something many people never develop, a solid internal foundation. You'll know who you are when no one's watching. You'll have clarity about what really matters to you. You'll have developed creative skills. You'll have a physical space that supports you. You'll have goals based on deep reflection instead of impulsive reaction. And more important than all of this, you'll have the experience of having stayed with yourself and survived. More than survived. Flourished. Because in the end, isolation isn't about being alone. It's about finally meeting yourself. It's about discovering that the companionship you most needed was always available. You were just too busy to notice. It's about learning that loneliness and isolation aren't the same thing. Loneliness is a feeling of emptiness, of lack. Isolation is just an external condition. And this condition, when embraced instead of resisted, can be the catalyst for the deepest growth of your life. Many people spend their entire lives surrounded by people, but profoundly alone. They never learned to be with themselves peacefully, never developed a healthy relationship with their own thoughts, never discovered they can be their own best company. Isolation teaches you this, forces you to learn. And once you learn, once you really internalize that you can count on yourself, that you can entertain yourself, console yourself, motivate yourself, an enormous freedom arises. You're no longer desperately dependent on external validation. You're no longer panicking when you need to spend time alone. You're no longer filling every second of silence with noise because silence scares you. You can sit in quietness and be okay. You can be with yourself and feel peace. And this is power. Real power. The kind of power no one can take from you. All dictators, all oppressive systems, all external controls depend on one thing: that you don't know how to manage on your own. That you constantly need external things. That you're easy to control through promises of external happiness. But when you discover you have everything you need within yourself, when you develop this emotional and psychological self-sufficiency, you become much harder to control, much harder to manipulate, much more free. And freedom is exactly what we're talking about. Not the freedom to do whatever you want without consequences, but the freedom to be who you are without needing permission. The freedom to find contentment, independent of external circumstances. The freedom to live according to your own values, instead of externally imposed values. Isolation, however challenging it may be, is an opportunity to conquer this freedom, to practice it, to develop it until it becomes second nature. And there's another interesting aspect to all this. When you develop this capacity to be okay alone, your relationships with other people improve dramatically. Because you're no longer relating from desperate need. You're no longer clinging to people out of fear of being alone. You're no longer tolerating bad behavior because being alone seems worse. You can choose to be with people because you genuinely value those people, not because you need them to feel complete. And this shift, though subtle, completely transforms the dynamic of any relationship. People feel when you're with them by genuine choice versus disguised need. And relationships based on choice are infinitely more satisfying than relationships based on dependence. So isolation, paradoxically, can prepare you for better relationships, for deeper connections, for real intimacy instead of desperate fusion. You learn the difference between being together and being stuck together, between sharing a life and losing your life in another person, between healthy love and toxic dependence. And all of this comes from having spent enough time with yourself to know who you are when you're alone, to develop a solid identity that doesn't dissolve in the presence of other people. This solid identity is like an anchor. The world can be chaotic out there, circumstances can change, people can come and go, but you remain. You know who you are, and this gives you a stability that no external circumstance can provide. Isolation is the laboratory where this anchor is forged. It's where you test your strength away from the currents that normally keep you in place. And when you discover you can stay stable even without these external currents, something fundamental changes in how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less dependent on approval, less shaken by criticism or rejections. Because you have a solid internal base, you know who you are, what you value, where you're going. And this isn't arrogance. It's not closing yourself off to feedback or to growth. It's having an internal structure strong enough to receive feedback without crumbling. It's having enough clarity to distinguish between constructive criticism and others' projection. It's having confidence not in the sense of thinking you're perfect, but in the sense of knowing you can handle imperfection. You can make mistakes and learn from them. You can fail and recover. You can face challenges and find a way. This confidence doesn't develop from reading self-help books. It doesn't come from positive affirmations repeated mechanically. It comes from real experience, from having faced isolation, loneliness, silence, and having come out the other side whole. It comes from having looked inward and having found not a scary emptiness, but an entire universe of possibilities. From having discovered internal resources you didn't know you had. From having surprised yourself with your own resilience. And once you have this experience, once you really know, at the visceral level and not just intellectually, that you can count on yourself, you carry this forever. It's embodied wisdom, something that lives in your bones. That's why isolation, when well used, isn't wasted time. It's not something to just survive and forget. It's a unique opportunity for development that normal life rarely offers. In the common routine, you never have this kind of uninterrupted time with yourself. You never have this chance to dive so deep. There's always something pulling you back to the surface, to external demands, to social performance. Isolation removes these interruptions. And yes, this can be uncomfortable. It can even be painful at first. But it's the kind of discomfort that leads to growth. The kind of pain that precedes transformation. It's like physical exercise. It hurts in the moment. You feel uncomfortable. You want to stop. But it's exactly this discomfort that's building muscles. That's increasing your capacity. That's making you stronger. Isolation is psychological and emotional exercise. It's building internal muscles that most people never develop. It's increasing your capacity to stay centered amid chaos. It's making you stronger in ways that aren't visible, but that are profoundly real. And when the world returns, when life resumes its frenetic pace, you'll have these muscles. You'll have this strength. And you won't be so easily dragged by the current anymore. You won't be so vulnerable to external waves. You'll have learned to find your center. And once you know how to find it, you can return to it whenever you need. Even amid the noise, even surrounded by people, even in the rush of daily life. Because the center isn't in a physical place. It doesn't depend on being alone or isolated. It's an internal state you can access at any time once you really know it. And knowing it requires time. It requires quietness. It requires isolation, at least initially. After you develop the skill, you can maintain it in any circumstance. But the initial development needs specific conditions. Think of an Olympic athlete. They don't train amid chaos. They isolate themselves, they focus, they create ideal conditions to develop their skills at the highest level. And then, in competition, amid the pressure and noise, these skills emerge naturally. The same happens with internal development. You train in the silence and quietness of isolation. You develop the skills. You strengthen the structure. You know yourself deeply. And then, when you return to the world, these skills accompany you. You can be in a stressful meeting and access that calm you developed in solitude. You can be in a conflict and respond from that stable center instead of reacting impulsively. You can be facing uncertainties and trust the internal clarity you cultivated. All these capacities begin in isolation. They're the hidden gifts within an experience that most people fear. And maybe that's exactly why isolation is so feared. Not because it's bad, but because it forces you to confront things you've been avoiding. It forces you to look at parts of yourself you've been neglecting. It forces you to feel feelings you've been suppressing. Society teaches us to always be busy, always distracted, always consuming. And this constant distraction serves a purpose. It prevents us from looking inward. It prevents us from asking difficult questions. It prevents us from realizing how dissatisfied we might be with the status quo. Because if you really stop and reflect on your life, on your choices, on where you're investing your time and energy, you might not like what you see. You might realize you're living the life that was expected of you instead of the life you really want. You might realize you're pursuing goals that were never yours. And this realization is dangerous to the system. Because people who really know themselves, who have clarity about what they want, who don't depend on external validation, are much harder to control. They're much harder to convince to keep running on the hamster wheel. Isolation is subversive in this way. It gives you time and space to wake up, to realize, to question. And once you start questioning, once you really examine the structures that govern your life, you can't see things the same way anymore. You realize how many of your choices were never really choices. How many of your needs are artificially created. How much of your suffering is unnecessary and self-imposed. And with this realization comes responsibility. Because now you know. You can no longer use ignorance as an excuse. You can no longer hide behind, "That's how things are," or "Everyone does it this way." You have to decide. Continue living on autopilot, following the script that was given to you. Or start writing your own script, based on who you really are and what you really value. This decision isn't easy. Writing your own script requires courage. It requires going against the current sometimes. It requires accepting that some people won't understand or support your choices. But it's the only decision that leads to true satisfaction. Because at the end of your life, you won't regret having tried to be authentic. You'll regret not having tried. Having let fear decide for you. Having lived a small life when you could have lived an expansive one. Isolation gives you a glimpse of what this expansive life could be. Of who you could be if you weren't constantly conforming to others' expectations. of what kind of work you could do if you really followed your passion, of how your days could be if you structured them according to your values instead of external demands. And this glimpse is transformative. It's like tasting freedom for the first time after years of captivity. You can't just forget what it's like. You can't completely go back to what you were before. Something changed, something fundamental. And even if you return to the same external life, you're different inside. And this internal difference eventually manifests externally. You start making different choices, small ones at first, saying no to things that don't serve you, yes to things that nourish you, reorganizing your priorities, redefining success on your own terms. And these small choices accumulate. They create momentum. They lead you to a life that increasingly looks like you. That increasingly aligns with who you really are. This is the true advantage of isolation. It's not just about surviving a difficult period. It's about using this period to reinvent yourself, to rediscover yourself, to return to who you always were before the world told you who you should be. It's about recovering parts of yourself that were lost in the race, about reintegrating aspects that were fragmented by the pressure to adapt, about becoming whole again. And when you become whole, when you're no longer divided between who you are and who you pretend to be, a deep peace settles in. Not the peace of absence of problems, but the peace of being aligned with yourself. You can face difficult challenges and still feel this peace, because you know you're facing these challenges as yourself, not as a performative version created to please others. You can make mistakes and still respect yourself, because you know your mistakes are yours, consciously chosen, not imposed by others' expectations that you internalized without questioning. You can fail and still maintain your dignity, because you know you failed trying something authentic, not wasting energy on something that was never yours to begin with. This is the dignity that isolation can restore, the dignity of being yourself in a world that constantly pressures you to be something else, the dignity of existing on your own terms instead of externally dictated terms. And maybe this is the greatest advantage of all. Not the skills you develop, not the projects you complete, not the insights you gain, but this fundamental recovery of your own dignity as a human being. The dignity of knowing you can stay with yourself and be okay. The dignity of not needing constant approval to validate your existence. The dignity of living according to your truth, even when that truth is inconvenient or unpopular. This dignity can't be given to you. It can't be bought or conquered through external achievements. It can only be recovered internally. And isolation creates the perfect conditions for this recovery. Because when all external voices get quiet, when all others' expectations are temporarily suspended, you can finally hear your own voice. You can recover your own authority over your life. You can remember you always had the right to choose. And this remembering, this recovery of personal agency, is revolutionary. It changes everything. Not overnight. Not in a dramatic and obvious way. But slowly and deeply, it restructures how you relate to the world. You stop living so reactively. You start living more intentionally. You stop feeling like a victim of circumstances. You start seeing yourself as co-author of your life. And yes, you don't control everything. External circumstances are real. Limitations are real. But within these realities, you always have choices. You always have agency. You always have the capacity to decide how to respond, how to interpret, how to move through experiences. Isolation reconnects you with this agency. It reminds you that you're not just a passive receptacle of external events. You're an active agent, capable of creating meaning, of making choices, of directing your attention and energy. And when you remember this, when you really embody this truth, you become much more powerful. Not in the sense of controlling others or having power over external circumstances, but powerful in the sense of having power over yourself, over your responses, over your internal narrative. You can be in a difficult situation and still choose your attitude toward it. You can be facing limitations and still find space for creativity within them. You can be isolated and still decide to use this isolation for growth instead of deterioration. This is the essence of human freedom. Not the absence of limitations, but the capacity to choose how to respond to them. And isolation is an intensive school in this freedom, because you're constantly being forced to choose. Will you surrender to despair, or will you find internal resources? Will you lament what you lost, or will you explore what you gained? Will you see isolation as a prison or as a retreat? Each of these choices shapes you. Each strengthens certain psychological muscles and weakens others. And the sum of these choices determines who you become during and after isolation. That's why it's so important to approach isolation consciously, with intention, with curiosity. Not just letting it happen, but actively participating in the experience. This doesn't mean being positive all the time. It doesn't mean denying difficulties or pretending everything's fine when it's not. It means being present with whatever is happening. It means feeling what you feel, but consciously choosing how to respond to these feelings. It means treating isolation as a journey instead of a sentence, as an opportunity instead of a punishment, as a chapter in your story instead of the end of it. And when you approach it this way, when you bring this quality of consciousness and intention to the experience, isolation transforms. It stops being something happening to you and becomes something you're actively going through. You become the protagonist of your own story again, not just a character being pushed by external forces, but someone who's making choices, making decisions, directing the narrative. And this shift in perspective, though subtle, is profoundly powerful. It transforms the subjective experience of isolation from something you're suffering to something you're using. You're using the time to grow, to know yourself, to develop skills, to clarify values, to create things, to rest and recover, to plant seeds that will bloom after isolation ends. And when you see it this way, isolation loses much of its terror, because it's no longer a threat. It's a tool. Uncomfortable? Maybe. Challenging? Definitely. But also useful. Also valuable. Also potentially transformative. So here's the truth that most people take years to discover. You don't need to fear isolation. You need to learn to use it. Because at some point in life, we all face periods where we're forced to stay with ourselves, without the normal distractions, without the habitual escapes. And these moments can be the most fertile of our existence, if we have the courage not to waste them. Isolation isn't the end of your story. It's just a different chapter. A chapter where the scenery changes, where the pace slows down, where you finally have time to process everything that happened before and prepare the ground for what comes next. And if you embrace this, if you really use this time in the way we explored here, you won't just survive isolation. You'll emerge from it stronger, clearer, more complete than you were when you entered. This is the promise, and also the responsibility. If this video helped you see isolation in a new way, if it gave you tools or perspectives that can make your journey more meaningful, leave your like. This shows me that this content is reaching the right people. And subscribe to the channel, because we continue exploring these deep ideas about how to live more consciously, more authentically, more aligned with who you really are. See you in the next video.